because it is Valentine's week, I did want to talk about the love. And more than that, it's a bigger picture here. We're going to be, over the next 4 weeks, talking about stories of redemption. There are 4 different stories that we're going to take from different places in the Bible, and we're going to see how the Bible is actually one big story with a redemption thread weaved all the way through. There are lots of smaller stories throughout Scriptures that carry the narrative towards Jesus. I enjoy story. I enjoy narrative. When you break something down in the actual details behind why people do certain things and why things play out the way they did, I enjoy that. So that's what we're going to look at, the stories of redemption. Our first one is Ruth, a love story. But before we get into that, let's look at what redemption is. Redemption is rescue. Redemption is finding forgiveness. It's finding home, finding acceptance, and finding belonging. So we're going to look at these different stories that show the redemption narrative, some from the Old Testament and some from the New Testament. Generally, I will do a more of a traditional outline with bullet points, 3 points in a poem, I guess is how the joke goes. But for the next few weeks, it's going to be more of storytelling. It's going to be more narrative. So with Valentine's Day being this week, we're going to begin with this love story. Now, the book of Ruth is a short story that's kind of sandwiched between the book of Judges and the books of Samuel. From Genesis all the way up to Judges, the Bible has been dominated by these larger-than-life characters. We know of Noah and the ark, Abraham and his covenant, Jacob and his 12 sons, Joseph and the coat of many colors. We know of Moses and the Exodus story, and Joshua and the battle of Jericho. And I spoke last week on Gideon, and also in the book of Judges is Samson. These stories and these big characters that we understand how things go. But these heroes of Israel experience these great miracles that kind of contributes to why we know them. We know Samson because he's strong, because he pulled down the temple of the Philistines. We know Joshua because of the battle of Jericho, because they shouted and the walls came down. But in Ruth, we meet ordinary people. It's not that way. These are not like Moses. They're more like us. There are actually no recorded miracles in the book of Ruth. There are no angels. There are no heavenly voices. Nobody parts the seas. Nobody calls for the sun to stand still in the sky. But God is very present in this story, and much like throughout our lives and the lives of the people in His Word, He's in the background. He's behind the scenes. Interestingly, Ruth is the only book in the Bible where women do more of the talking than men. Women kind of get a bad rap about talking so much, but in the Bible, it's the men that won't shut up. Let that one resonate for a minute. But this story gives us a different perspective than other books, especially in this part of the Bible. So it begins with an economic crisis. They're an agricultural community, so when a famine takes place, they have no way to make money. And that's an economic crisis for them. And as we know, things like this always tend to hit the ordinary people first. So that's the setting for Ruth, the love story. That's how this all is kind of taking place. Now that you know the setting, let's dive right in to once upon a time. There was a man. He was from the tribe of Judah. And he lived in a village called Bethlehem. Bethlehem at this point was just a small little town. It wasn't what it would become. Bethlehem is known as the city of David, but there was no David. So this was just this small little village of Bethlehem. Jerusalem had not even been built yet. But this man from Bethlehem had a wife named Naomi, and together they had 2 sons. And it's about the time that these sons were supposed to get married that this economic crisis hits. So they can no longer raise crops in their land because of the famine, so they have to go somewhere else. They just pack up and leave their home, their livelihood, and it was their family land that had been in their family ever since they came into the promised land from wandering in the wilderness. So in order to find work and maybe a brighter future, they traveled to a nearby country called Moab. And not long after they arrived in Moab, the 2 sons married Moabite women. One son married a woman named Orpah, And the other son married a woman named Ruth. These two women were from Moab. Well, times got more difficult as the father suddenly died. Naomi's husband died. Now, Naomi was a widow living in Moab with her sons and their wives, which was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been, because the way that the culture was for the Israelites was, as long as you had sons that could have more sons, then the mother, the widow, would be taken care of throughout her years. Well, so she's okay. 10 years living in Moab, her sons died as well. We don't know what happened. We don't know if it was a disease epidemic or a tragic accident. All we know is that those sons died, and now there are these 3 women widowed. Naomi has lost everything. She moved away from home to follow her husband because there was famine in the land. He's gone. So then her sons die 10 years later. Now there's nothing except these widows. And she just wants to go back home. You ever been there? You ever had a bad day and you just want to go home? If I could just get home. I just want to say, right? You know, I got my chair, and there are times when I come in and my kids are in my chair, and if I'm having one of those days, I'll just go, mm-mm. And they'll get out of my chair, and I can sit down in my chair, and I can turn on the news and yell at the TV for an hour or so. Or whatever it is, turn on a football game. But it's just something about going home. Now, she had nothing really back at home that was going to help her out. She had no family, but she just knew that if I could just go back home. And these 2 widowed daughters-in-law decide to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem. And on the way back, Naomi just stops. She suddenly stops, and she turns around to the girls and says, look, you loved my sons, and you love me. And this is great. You guys, you girls have been so good with me. But there's no sense in sticking with me. I have no other sons for you to marry. Go back home to Moab. Orpah kind of sees this as her way out. She was good. She was faithful. She stuck around with Naomi and was a good daughter-in-law, but she kissed Naomi and went back to Moab. Ruth didn't. She spoke these famous words in chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Amen. Ruth took a step further there. She said, it's not just that she had nowhere to go. It's, I will go where you go. And it's not that she didn't have anywhere to stay. It's like, but if you stay somewhere, I'll stay somewhere. And she went that even further step. Not just, I want to be with you, but I want to worship the same God that you worship. And she made a decision there to go into the unknown. So Ruth sticks with Naomi, both poor widows, no prospects. They make the trip back to Bethlehem together. But Naomi hadn't been there in 10 years. It's a small village, though. It's a small town. So if you ever been away from your small town, you come back to your hometown and people recognize you, that's what it was. She comes walking back in and people see her and they're like, hey, it's Naomi. Now, this is, like I said, this is a small town. David had not been born yet, so it was not the city of David, the greatest king of Israel. There was no Jerusalem that was not far from Bethlehem. It hadn't been built yet. So it's just this small region. They could see her coming from afar off. They're like, I think that's Naomi. Verse 20, but she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. I left here with a full family. I left here with a husband. Yeah, we didn't have much prospects, but at least I had my man. I left here with my sons, my pride, and I'm coming back with nothing. Ruth is with me. She has nothing. Naomi's in her 50s. Ruth is in her 20s. And they're now part of the lowest social class. They are poor. They are widows. And Ruth is a foreigner. They need help. They need to be rescued. They need redemption. They need what the Bible calls justice. And now what the Bible calls justice and what we've been cultured to think justice is, those aren't the same thing. And it's important to understand the distinction here. In our society, we view justice almost entirely to mean punishment for a crime committed. If somebody does us wrong and we see them get their due justice. Somebody does something wrong to them. Some people might call it karma. I would ask that if you're Christians, refrain from using that term, since that is an entirely different religion. So let's not use karma. There are principles of sowing and reaping. But justice in our culture means if someone robs from me, I want to see justice. But the Bible doesn't use justice in that way. In the Bible, when the term justice is used, almost entirely it means restoring or setting things right. So what do poor widows who have no way to make a living for themselves, what do they need? They need justice. They need things to be made right. And fortunately, they're in a place in the nation of Israel that they're under the law of the Torah. They're under the covenant. And that covenant law is very specific about how to care for people in this situation. There was law in Israel, not in Moab where Ruth was from, but in Israel there was law that when people are harvesting their fields, they must leave the corners of the fields for the poor, for the widow, and for the foreigner. That gives the poor, the widows, and the foreigners a chance to eat and perhaps even make a little living. They can go, and it's called gleaning. They can glean from what's left in these fields to feed themselves. And if there's enough, they can go and sell some and kind of make a little bit of a living. There were other parts to that law too. If you had a bundled sheath on your wagon and it fell off, you couldn't pick that up. They believed that was God knocking that off the end of the wagon there, and that was a divine providence for them to go along, and that belonged to the poor, the widow, and the foreigner. Israel had a deep concern for the less fortunate. And I say the poor, the widow, and the foreigner. Let me bring it into a little bit better context here. The poor, the widow, and the illegal alien. But that's my field. That's my grain. I worked hard for that. Why do I have to give it to them? And God says, well, actually, that's my field. You're just farming it. And we're going to take care of people here. So we're at harvest time in our story here. And the poor are able to glean. But that doesn't mean it's a safe place for these women. So just like today, even back then, there were people who would take advantage of the law. There were people who would say, instead of working, I'm just going to go glean because I can glean. And it wasn't always the most upstanding people. So you've got these women who now are supposed to go and glean, and that's how they're going to provide for themselves. But it's not safe for them, especially for Ruth, who is a foreigner. She's an illegal, and she's gleaning in the property of an Israelite. So there's even more because of her nationality here, because she is a Moabitess, that I'm going to get into in just a second. But Naomi is of the age where she can't glean anymore. So Ruth is the one who has to do all the work. So Ruth is going to do this in a place that's unsafe, and there are people who might harm her. So Naomi tells Ruth where to start. There's a cousin of her late husband who owns a field. Go start with him. And Naomi has Ruth go to this man named Boaz. Boaz is the field where she's told to start. So she goes and she begins to glean what's left. And while this is happening, she catches the eye of Boaz. An attractive young woman is now gleaning in his field, and he's out there, hey, who's that? Chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Now, Ruth is a Moabite. He knows that she's from Moab. Twice in that verse, the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Moab was not just another group of people. It's not, it was a country that was near there, but it wasn't just like another part of the region. Like we live in Dundee, and we know those people over there from Mulberry are different, but they're just, no, it's not like, we're all in Polk County together. No, Moab, there was some history there. Back when the children of Israel were making their way into the promised land, there was an incident that took place by the acacia grove. A number of Moabite prostitutes came to the camp of the Israelites, and they began to convince the men to worship Baal of Peor, God, and it created a scandal. So as a result, they worked something into the law against the Moabites, that they were permanently excluded from Israelite society. Because these men could not control themselves, it's the fault of those other people. So we're just going to say we won't have anything to do with those people. Not only will we not have anything to do with those people, but those people can never have anything to do with us. Yet Boaz has a Moabite woman gleaning in his field, and he knows exactly who she is. I learned this when I was a teenager, and I got pretty good at it. You have to know the rules well so you can know how to break them correctly. That premise works actually all the way through the Bible, and if you don't like that, neither did the Pharisees. Because Jesus knew the rules well, and he knew how to break them properly. But Boaz approached Ruth, and he introduces himself, and he goes to tell her that he has other fields. You can glean in these other fields. And stick to my fields, and you won't be harassed. There's a lot of bad people out there, so Boaz has his people kind of watch what's going on. In fact, he tells them that he's going to have his servants draw water, and she can take that water as well, so she didn't even have to do that. Boaz is really looking out for her. He's really taking care of her. Verse 10, so she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. That last verse there is a blessing. He blesses her. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Take that word wings, put it over here, put a pin in it, because we're going to come back to it in just a few minutes. She has no place in Israeli society. She has no place. She's a Moabitess. She's a woman from a country that they have made laws you cannot. And Boaz knows this, and yet he blesses her by the Lord God of Israel. Now, she had forsaken anything to do with Moab. Yes, they were the ones who seduced the Israelite men, and they began to worship the false god. But remember, Ruth said, where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your God will be my God. So we have this woman here, and she receives this blessing not to be cast out, not to be forbidden, but the Lord would place her under his wings. You have to know the rules well, so you can know how to break them properly. So it's lunchtime. Boaz motions to her and invites her to dip the bread in the wine, and they're having communion. Thousands of years before Jesus would ever be born. You see, all throughout the Old Testament, you'll see images of Jesus. In just about every book of every book of the Old Testament, you can see a shadow image of Jesus. It's incomplete because there is only one Savior. There is only one Jesus Christ, the Messiah. But there are images of him that come through the Old Testament, foreshadowing what's to come. And here it is, they're having the bread and the wine, partaking in the ultimate redemption story, thousands of years before it takes place. So after this, Ruth goes back out into the field, and Boaz instructs his workers to accidentally knock a sheath off the end of the wagon. Oh, whoops. Yeah, Ruth, go ahead. I guess that one's for you. So she goes back, and a very profitable day. And she tells Naomi about this guy named Boaz and how he was kind to her. And she ends up going back day after day. And it's a wonderful blessing for her. And Boaz just continues to make sure that she's taken care of until the end of the harvest. Now we've gotten to the end of the harvest, and Naomi is like, all right, here we go. I got an idea. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 2. He's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies. You shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you should do. So Ruth follows the instructions. She does all this. Verse 8, now it happened at midnight, the man was startled. He turned himself, and there was a woman lying at his feet, and he said, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing. Let me pull that pen back out. For you are a close relative. Remember, Boaz used that term, blessing her in the name of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wing she would dwell. That word wing is also translated as blanket. Stretch your blanket over me, for you are my redeemer. Just before dawn, Boaz sends Ruth out, because there's been people who've tried to take this out of context and said that, that's a Moabitess woman. You know what she was doing in there. We know what that blanket thing means. I'll tell you exactly what it means. It means exactly what the text says it means. Because Ruth had forsaken the pagan ways of her people and had accepted, where Naomi's God, your God shall be my God. So in order not to ruin her reputation, he sends her away before dawn and promises that he'll take care of things before the day's over. So Boaz, he goes to the city gates. And the city gates at the time were like the courthouse or city hall. It's where all the business of the town was done. So they go, and he goes and looks around. He's trying to find the guy who originally took possession of their land 10 years ago when they left. And he finds him, and the way the law was set up was that anybody who was family could redeem that land. He would go to the person who the money was owed and say, I am Boaz, I am a second cousin to Naomi's husband, and I want this land. And so he finds it, but there was a problem. There was somebody else who was a closer relative who had claim to the land. Boaz kind of explains this situation to him. So the creditor had to sell it because it's family land, and Israel was very much about keeping the land in the family. So he went to this guy and this closer relative, and he said, hey, cousin Boaz, how you doing? Hey, cousin Aloysius, whatever his name was, it doesn't matter. Could have been Skippy. But he said, here's the deal. Naomi's back. And her husband was our mutual cousin. And there's an opportunity to redeem this land. This land can be yours. You have the first right of refusal. So I just wanted to let you know what was going on. And the guy's like, hey, wait a minute, all right. He sees a chance to grow his estate. He's got a wife and kids at home, and he would like to grow his ability to provide for them. So he sees an opportunity. All right, I'll do it. But then Boaz kind of goes on and mentions the rest of the story. Chapter 3, verse 5. Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. So, not only will you get this land, but you also will get Ruth. And because Ruth died, Ruth's husband died, having no children, you will now have to have children with Ruth, and then that land will go with them, not with your kids, and it won't be your land. Because as the kinsman redeemer, the way the law was set up, it was originally for Naomi's husband's line. And so he went from going, yeah, I'm going to grow my estate here, this is going to be awesome, to be like, wait, another wife? I got one of those, and I love her. And I do not want to do anything to mess things up with her. Oh, I got to have a kid with that woman too? And all that won't be mine? I don't want it. It's yours. You can have it. And so he refused. He said no. He's no longer interested. That changes everything. So Boaz marries Ruth, and they all lived happily ever after. Wow. That's not the end of the story, though. I know, you're like, oh, is he really done? No. See, because what happens is Ruth and Boaz do get married, and they have a son. And by having a son, that now means that this line will continue on. But it's not just the fact that the line will continue on. There's something more. That son's name is Obed. Some people may not understand, those of you who've read through the Bible, that name might sound familiar. But Obed would grow up and get married, and he had that land. Boaz's son Obed would inherit that land. Obed would have a son, and his name would be Jesse. Jesse would eventually inherit that land. That same land that was redeemed by Boaz, that was through that family line that goes way back, all the way back to the tribe of Judah. Jesse would have a bunch of sons. And as his sons would grow up, they would go out and be shepherds in the field until they were old enough to go fight in the army. You see, because by this time, by Jesse's time, when Jesse's having kids, they now have a king. This king's name was Saul. They said, if you want, God told them, if you want a king, I'll give you a king, but he'll take your sons to war. So that's what happened. Jesse's sons began to go off to war until the last one of Jesse's sons is out in the field one day. And a man named Samuel comes and speaks to Jesse and says, I want to see your sons. And when that final son comes in, he's anointed to be the greatest king of Israel, David. Ruth was King David's great-grandmother. I don't want you to miss this. Ruth was an illegal alien who had absolutely no right to partake in the blessings of that country. Yet God chose her to be the great-grandmother of the greatest king of Israel. It doesn't just stop there either. You see, because there are 5 women in the entire Bible that are mentioned in the lineage of Jesus. And if you read the book of Matthew, at the very beginning of Matthew, it tells the lineage of Jesus, and you can trace Jesus all the way back to Adam, proving who he is. So you look and you see these women. You see Tamar. Tamar was raped by her half-brother. Tamar is one who seduced her father-in-law because there was some confusion and they were not perpetuating the line through her. Every one of these 5 women have some sort of scandal surrounding them. So Tamar was the first one mentioned. The second one was Rahab. Rahab was the Canaanite prostitute. She had some skeletons in her closet. She was a lady of the night, yet she ended up marrying into the lineage of Jesus. The third was this one, Ruth, this Moabite. This foreigner, this illegal alien who was banned and forbidden from anything in Jewish culture, she is redeemed and brought into the family of God and the lineage of Jesus. Her great-grandson's wife, Bathsheba, what's the controversy surrounding her? We know David messed up. He should have been at war when kings were at war. But instead, he was at home looking at something he shouldn't have been looking at. And so what ended up happening? He murdered her husband so that he could become husband. And the 5th woman that's mentioned, while the scandal is unlike any other, it is still scandal, and that is Mary, the mother of Jesus. An unwed, teenage, pregnant girl comes walking in, and everybody can see what's going on with her, because when you're pregnant, people might think that I got that going on because it's large, but you carry it around with you. And while Mary was blameless, Mary did not, she was blessed and highly favored among women, yet there was still scandal surrounding her pregnancy. All 5 of these women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus endured scandal. And all 5 of them had their stories redeemed in Jesus. Will you stand with me this morning? You see, that's the end of Ruth's story, and that's the end of our story for now. Over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about Simeon Bacchus, the Ethiopian eunuch. We're going to talk about Mephibosheth. We're going to talk about a few different stories of redemption throughout the Scriptures. But what I want to do as I'm closing today is we're going to come together this morning, and we're going to say the same thing that Ruth. Lord, spread your wings of love over me, for you are my Redeemer. And what will happen? Jesus will spread his wings of love over you, He will spread his blanket over you. He will bring you in. He will wrap you in his loving arms, and he will tell you, it's okay. I'm here.